Hope you're doing well. I'm having a good morning. How about you? Good to be here. Good to be in church. We like church, don't we? I like church. I like church a bunch. A lot better than what the world has to offer, that's for sure. Why don't you go ahead and turn to John 9, kind of like I said last week. We're going to go back there and do a couple of things. This morning may resemble a little bit more like a Wednesday night than a Sunday morning, just for my purposes, I guess, in wanting to start another series, hopefully not 2 years long, hopefully get it done in a reasonable amount of time, but call it just, again, the Church Manifesto. We'll talk more about that. See, this is stupid. I hate this. I got to stop messing with it. Okay. But to lay the foundation for, there's times in preaching when I just tend to bite off more than I can chew, more than you can chew. And I went home last week thinking, you know what? I had to hurry over and skip over the most important parts of the message last week because I had taken until like 1:30 to finish. And I don't want to do that again. So I told Kevin, I said, I'm basically going to preach the same message. And if I hadn't told you, I thought, only about 5 or 10% will know that I preach the same message. And he said, I think you're overestimating. So that's either a commentary on you or me or both. I don't know which one. But one of the things I wanted to do is make some statement about because one of the things you hear all the time is, people are just bewildered. They're bewildered about the world. They're bewildered about the state of the church, right? Churches in America, churches, move this down a little bit, churches that they know about, people that their loved ones go to. Why are churches so different? Why does one church focus on this and seemingly ignore this, and so on and so forth, back and forth? There's a lot less uniformity in what churches are about than what there used to be. And so I wanted to sort of address that and some of the reasons why it happened. And I think one of the goals, again, is to explain why things in this country are really so inexplicable. Which, of course, is sort of an oxymoron, I think, to explain the inexplicable or the unexplainable. But by taking a look at recent church history, and that's what we started to do. Actually, I did, but I hurried it over, and I got to hurry so that I don't have to do this whole thing over again. I hate to preach this for 3 weeks in a row. But let me just remind you what the Bible seems to put forward as the ultimate mission of the church, right? Of churches. And that is, you probably don't remember, if I say the first word, you might remember the other two. First one was worship, the second one was fellowship, and the third is discipleship. That's really what churches are called to do. And understand that things flow from that. As believers begin to grow and mature through worship, fellowship, discipleship, they begin to affect the world around them. Right? It's not a political movement per se, but it's an involvement in their culture. It's an involvement in the issues of their day that they become more accustomed to and more competent about as they worship, fellowship, discipleship, or are discipled. And if we stray from that, we're in trouble. I can tell each, again, I guess the only thing, illustration I can have of this is politics, I guess. I can tell you all who to vote for, but that doesn't do anybody any good. That's why I don't hardly talk about stuff like elections, right? Because telling somebody what to do only goes so far. What's that old expression? Give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach him to fish. What, you make him a liar for a lifetime? Is that what it says? Or you feed him for a lifetime, right? That's the idea. The goal here is to teach people to be believers in this world. And in so doing, you affect the people around you. And if we all do it together, it's almost frightening the amount of people that can be affected. Does that make sense? That's why I really see the church mainly as trying and seeking to accomplish those three things: worship, fellowship, and discipleship. And so one of the things I started to make, I'm going to recap some stuff a little more briefly, get to the end here really quick. But what I wanted to make clear is that these essentials began to be incidental in churches around 1990. I know you don't have probably a handy-dandy handbook of church history in America since 1990, but let me assure you that churches began to change around 1990, the year Cheryl and I got married. All sorts of ideas crept into the church, and it was for a lot of different reasons. But when I say worship, fellowship, and discipleship was incidental, I mean the churches began to redefine what worship, fellowship, and discipleship actually meant. and how we accomplish those things. I keep knocking that thing. Hopefully I'm not turning it off. And how we accomplish those things. And I want to see something here. I want to make sure that I'm not out in the cold here. Okay. And what it meant to accomplish those things. And what happened is those things were basically redefined in order to attract a crowd. Look, we in America, we're impressed by big things, right? You ever heard the expression, living things grow, in regards to church? Anybody? It's one of the biggest lies ever told. Because it's always about living things grow, certainly, but they grow spiritually, not necessarily numerically. Does that make sense? But that's what we began to appreciate. We began to appreciate full buildings and lots of people and new buildings and all this sort of stuff. It was just part of church that crept in the 1990s. I know it's probably a little more information than you need, but just stick with me, because some of it will be a little bit more clear as we go through this. And not all churches, mind you, but a great deal of them. And again, the most high-profile churches were like this. And trust me, I'm not making any friends of my colleagues when I say this sort of stuff. That's for sure. Let me just go back to what we said last time. We were in John chapter 9 about the man born blind that Jesus healed, right? Jesus healed, and it was such a miracle that they brought him before, right, the council, the Pharisees and so forth. And he says in verse 11 that Jesus, he made some clay, made me to see again. The Pharisees were somewhat flummoxed and said, well, he can't be of God because he healed on the Sabbath day. And the blind man, I don't know if he's of God or not. I just know that I was blind, now I see. And then they so much disbelieved that this could happen is that they invited his parents in, and that's where we kind of took off. But let me just do this really quick. This is what he just said. That's the mission of the church: worship, fellowship, and discipleship. Okay? Second, we're going to talk about a manifesto, right? We talked about this last time. A written statement declaring publicly the intentions, motives, or views of an issuer. In other words, we're talking about what we will do as a church. Does that make sense? Like I said, the only other manifesto there's two manifestos. One was communist and one's the fiberglass manifesto. This is not a communist manifesto, but the fiberglass manifesto is about using fiberglass fly rods. That's actually worth checking out. Without an advocate, we're going to talk about an advocate. An advocate is a person who publicly supports or recommends a particular cause. And that's what we're sort of looking at here when it comes to this man born blind and the relationship that what happened with his parents. We just talked about the miracle. We talked about that last time. And the examination, let's take a look at really just to reacquaint ourselves in verse 15. Then again, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He said unto them, he put clay upon my eyes, and I washed and do see. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, this man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. And then they bring in, it's important to understand, they bring in the parents. Right? And this is what we call basically the equivocation. I'm getting behind on all my slides here, but the miracle, the examination, and the examination was they asked his parents, but what you want to note here is a little bit, his parents, verse 20, answered them and said, we know that this is our son, that he was born blind, but by what means he now seeth we know not, or hath opened his eyes we know not. He is of age, ask him, he shall speak for himself. These words spake his parents because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Therefore said his parents, he is of age, ask him. And so what you have here is an examination, but the parents are well aware that there's a penalty for advocating for Christ or their son. We talked last week, why didn't these guys stand up and say, my goodness, this is our son, he was blind, but this fantastic man Jesus has restored his sight, and we will be his disciples as well. There was none of that at all. There was an equivocation, which is the next thing here. That's what his parents did. They equivocated because they were afraid. They were afraid of what would happen to them in the world. In other words, they weren't standing strong for Christ. They weren't even standing strong for their own son, because if they showed a little too much enthusiasm for a healing of their son by a man that the Pharisees had decided was going to get people kicked out of synagogue if they embraced, they withdrew. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying there? And so we came back and in terms of an application for us, that the Pharisees are a little bit like the world. The world guarantees that if you stand for Christ, that if you advocate for the gospel, that you will suffer for it. And it's everything from shame or ridicule to genuine suffering. The world practically guarantees it. And we talked about how what has happened, in the last 35 years is basically you've got a situation where churches went from being advocates of Christ in the marketplace or even in the lives of kids in their church. We decided to leave off those three things of worship, fellowship, discipleship. We at times redefined them in order to let things go over a little easier. We were thinking about kids and so forth, and churches went from being hubs of those things, those three things, because one of the things that happened is, you've heard the phrase, America's a Christian nation. Yes? Think of that phrase as home field advantage. I mean, we had home field advantage. And we didn't have to try very hard to get people to receive Christ or be Christians or come to church. That's what a lot of people just automatically did. When you were witnessing to somebody 30 years ago, you didn't have to explain to them what sin was. You do now, right? And so that was the kind of home field advantage. Culturally, people went to church. Culturally, people were raised Christian even if they weren't actual Christians. Does that make sense? That's the home field advantage. And what happens when you have home field advantage in this situation, you can get a little lazy, right? And instead of engaging younger generations with the truth, instead of showing them how it applies to the bewildering questions they began to face, and I'm not talking about here because I have no idea what happened here. I'm just saying churches, a lot of churches in general, just got lazy. We didn't address those things. We just said, here's truth, believe it, see you later, here's a graham cracker. I mean, that's what we did. And we didn't set them aside and say, this is what this means. And isn't this interesting how this fits? And here's the entire faith of Christianity. And isn't it interesting? And doesn't it fit together almost miraculously? What we did was we ordered curriculums. And we said to some well-meaning saint, learn this and teach it to a kid on Sunday. And they did. But again, we didn't actually teach them. Again, we told them who to vote for. And when they left, they decided they were going to vote for somebody else, if that makes sense. We gave them a fish, and when we cut them loose from church, they did not know how to fish themselves, and so they starved. Does that make sense? That's what a lot of churches, that's what happens when you have home field advantage. So that's what happens, that's kind of what happened in a lot of churches. The other churches went a different direction. Because those churches were boring. I mean, kids couldn't wait to get out of those churches, right? Because we were still using flannel graph when video games came along. And so the other churches went a whole different way. I'm working out a doctoral thesis in front of you, actually, is what I'm doing. And they went the other way, and they became very laid back. Books like User-Friendly and Dying for Change were very popular, and it said, you've got to stop teaching this stuff the way you're teaching. In fact, let's just redefine what is necessary. We don't need to learn things like the Trinity. We don't need to teach generations about the Bible and the inspiration of the Bible. We don't need to teach the generations of what the gospel is. We just need them to say a prayer and kick them on the way out. We need them to come in and have a good time. We need to give them music like what they hear in their car. Does that make sense? And what happens is, in churches, beginning in the 1990s, boring was the kiss of death. I mean, you couldn't fill a room. You couldn't fill a room half this size if you were boring. And sometimes, here's the problem, sometimes teaching the faith is kind of not exciting. I won't say boring. Not exciting. Because it's learning. Learning algebra is not exciting. But you kind of got to do it, don't you? I mean, you kind of got to make, and the teachers that you remember best from your school days are the ones who made the classroom what? Fun, interesting, right? So again, the other churches swung the other way. Come on in, it won't be much different from what you experience in your everyday life, and that will be great for you. And then the hope was, I'm not saying, these were well-meaning people. And the hope was that you could attract a crowd based upon good times and big energy and everything else, and then you could kind of slip Christianity in there. Does that make sense? I hope nobody I know listens to this stuff. You could have sermon series on the latest blockbuster movie, right? And we'll slip Christianity into Jurassic Park. It's true. You're laughing because you know what I'm saying is true. You could have sermon series on some of people's favorite rock music or country music. We'll have a sermon series on AC/DC's Back in Black, and we'll slip Jesus in there. It's true. Again, I'm saying they're well-meaning people. But it produced a generation and a half of Christian illiterates. And that's a problem. Does that make sense? I mean, that's just like, I guess, Cliff's notes on 30 years of church history right there. And they did it again. They did it by imitating the world in ways that's just impossible for all but the biggest congregations in America. Anybody here heard of Saddleback Church? Okay, Rick Warren, you've heard of Rick Warren? Everybody tried to copy old Rick Warren. You know how many middle-aged guys started wearing Hawaiian shirts in the 2000s to church? Guys that I knew wore three-piece suits, threw them away, and went and bought Hawaiian shirts, right? Because that was going to build a church, right? Well-meaning, but kind of weird in a lot of ways. And so when smaller churches tried to do that, you can't compete with the world. You can't compete with the world in terms of entertainment or in terms of an excitement, I suppose. So it all combined to give us this culture both nationally, because the generations that we had in our midst went out and we thought they were Christians and we thought they'd learned Christianity, but they didn't. And all of a sudden they started to switch teams, as it were. And it all combined to give us a culture and a society that is determined to live fantasies, I said this last week, to live fantasies while vilifying those who refuse to. Look, here's the deal. I shouldn't say this. You want to live like a girl and you're a guy? You go right ahead. But don't expect me to treat you like a girl. All right? I know that sounds political. It's not political. It's biblical. And there's problem. That's what I'm saying. One of the reasons that we have, and this is what I think at some point every church has to embrace or own just a little bit. We helped create the culture that we find so bewildering. Not intentionally, and when we had good intentions in not doing it, but somehow on my watch, it happened. And it's because, at least in my case, I think we got lazy. I'm talking about me because I pastored for 25 years before I was ever here. We got lazy and we wanted people to have fun and enjoy church, and it was all the best intentions, but it's had disastrous consequences, right? So again, what you have is, one of the, and part of, I'm going to get to the end here, I swear, I'm going to get to the end. There's two extremes that we should stay away from in looking at how to solve this. And I think this is what happened. I think Christians, churches were established, and please understand I say this from an understanding perspective. We taught as doctrine things that were preferences. I said this last week. You cannot teach a generation that all God cares about is what you do, what you wear, how you talk, how you cut your hair. You can't. And we did that. Didn't we? We didn't try to do that. That's what I'm saying. We tried to make this seem more comprehensive. But you ask the generation and a half that walked away, and that's what they'll tell you. It was all don't. Every place you see, and here's something to remember this, is that every place you see in the Bible where the Lord says stop doing something, he says to start doing something else. The Bible is not a book of don'ts. And I fear that that's, again, one of the things that happened to produce the situation we have now, both in church and America. Again, guys like me, we're the ones that bear the burden of that. I mean, we own that. And that's really sad. But then there's the other side, what happened, and this is, again, just as bad, is churches stopped teaching Christianity. We just stopped because that's boring. And because people don't want to hear the term supralapsarian theory of soteriology. Right? You don't. Okay. But don't we make the big bucks to make that a simple idea to you? See, that's what I'm saying is that you can teach theology and doctrine and it be enormously interesting and it make an enormous difference in people's lives. Does that make sense? But we stopped doing that because it's considered boring. And we've got what we have today. So I'm going to go back to all of my stats because I want you to see them again. Because this is the stats of what's happened in Christianity in America. I hope that my slides are up anyway. 31% of Christians become disaffiliated before they turn 30. I said this last week. Anybody remember this? It means that if you're raised in church, if you're a kid in church, 30% of the people that you raise in church will be disaffiliated before they turn 30. That doesn't count the ones that are disaffiliated at 40 or 45. That means we've done a very poor job of instructing young believers why Christianity is not simply a religion among many. That quote right there is one of my favorites of all times. You would do yourself a favor to write that down if you write nothing else down. Francis Schaeffer was talking to youth pastors in the 70s. I can't find the source for this quote, but I heard it. And he was teaching them, and he said this, please, 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 when you teach your kids, do not teach them that the gospel is first true, not helpful. And what we did was, we taught people it was helpful. That if you take Jesus, you'll get a parking place downtown. If you receive Jesus, you'll never have girlfriend problems again. If you receive Jesus, he will help you get along with your parents. And you know what? When that didn't happen, what happened? People wandered away in droves. They may have even said a prayer at some time, but they came looking for this utilitarian Jesus who is going to help them. And what Schaeffer said, and this is the heart of what we need to talk about, is that the gospel is true. Jesus really rose from the dead. It happened in history. You have to reckon your life with that. That if you're talking about Christ, we're talking about something that genuinely, actually happened, and that everyone will reckon with at some point in life, whether it be when he comes again or whether they die. It's true. You don't have the option to say, I don't think it's true, because it is. But what many churches started doing in the 90s is saying Jesus is helpful. He will help you control your anger. He will help you raise your kids. He will help you change diapers. He will help you understand your spouse. I mean, that's what started to happen. We had a generation and a half of people who were raised up in church, and church told them Jesus would be helpful. And when life came at them with both knuckles bare, when the world was just spent the last 30 years working out in the prison yard on free weights and punched them in the mouth, Jesus isn't very helpful. Why didn't Jesus help me with that? And they have no use for him. No, the gospel is not Jesus is helpful. The gospel is that Jesus lived a sinless life and died a sacrificial death and rose again on the third day that he could redeem a people unto himself that would become peculiar in this world. And I've got to go on. 31% do that, because this is something worth second is this. The average Christian in the United States is 43. I mentioned this, which again, I know it's a relative idea, but it's a bad number. It's a very, very bad number. It shows that churches and Christian families have failed pretty spectacularly at passing on the faith to their kids. And again, not that they didn't try. They tried. I've talked to so many people who are broken up about their family, and they tried. But it doesn't change the fact that in a lot of ways, we didn't do a great job. Some pass on a form of religion down that was boiled down to do's and don'ts. That happens. Some pass nothing on but good times to their kids. Again, that church was supposed to be a good time. And this is what we told kids. And this is something for parents too. I think it's 9:55 on the West Coast, isn't it? But listen to me. Listen to me. One of the things that started happening in the 90s, I think, if our kids didn't want to go, we didn't make them go. If our kids didn't like it, we were looking for something else. I'm saying you don't have to settle for one or the other, right? But the idea was, and this is why churches started doing it more, was because they wanted, I know a church that their entire marketing strategy in Iowa, of all places, in Des Moines, their entire marketing strategy was get the kids, because then the adults will follow. Well, wait a second. Who are the parents? I'm sorry. That's just frustration talking. Frustration talking. Does that make sense, though? If the average age of the Christians in America is 43, it means that again, if I can go back to our fall kickoff sporting analogy, we missed a couple recruiting classes. And that spells trouble. It spells trouble down the line. Again, what these stats are the things that I read about when I was getting my degrees about what could happen in Christianity that I thought were just so far-fetched and out of the question, and they've landed right on our doorstep. Here's something else. I'm going to hurry with these, all right? And then I'm going to get to the end. Here it is this. Because of what I just said, because of the average age and because of the 30%, here we go. This is the thing. In 2021, church membership dropped below 50% nationally for the first time in a billion years. That's the stat. There was 73% in 1937, 70% through 2000. How many in here think 2000 was a couple years ago? I do. It's like, what are you talking about 22 years ago? I literally, this morning, I was finishing something up at the house, and I was thinking about I think about the year 2000. I don't remember why it was 2000, but I was thinking about it. And I'm like, that was a couple years ago. And I thought, no, it's longer than that. What's the date? And my head said, well, it's 2022. And I'm like, no, it can't be 2022. It is, right? So in 2000, it started going backward in earnest. It dropped again 10% in 10 years, and then it dropped another, what do you got there, 14% in 10 years? Keep following the percentages. It gets ugly in a hurry, right? Millennials, ages 21 to 41, only 36% identify with the church. I mean, those are adults, by the way. Only 36% of people aged 36 to 40 identify with the church. Okay. Here's the question: how many of those kids were raised in church? See the problem? See the problem we've got? Again, Gen Z, and nobody actually knows what Generation Z is, and all of this stuff is just all sort of statistics. Anyway, but 33% say they have no religious affiliation, but of course some of them are 10 years old, and I don't know if they're a part of that. It's just what's happening is that people are saying, I want no part of that, because I don't think we've done a great job at worship, fellowship, discipleship. But let me just go on just a couple more things here. Because we talked about this, between 2000 and 2020, median church service attendance dropped from 137 to 65 in America. So again, that includes the mega churches. You're an exceptional church in terms of attendance. But this is the thing, everybody looks at mega churches and think, we should be that big. Well, wait a second, you're already exceptional because the median size is 65. But it used to be almost double that not very long ago. Here's another thing here. Christians could make up less than half the population in as little as a third in 50 years. And again, we talked about this, that the percentage of Americans who identify as other faiths has doubled, and there's no data to say that there's anything that's going to turn around, right? So we're reaping the benefits, I think, or the badness of not taking our kids, not taking a generation, and not even taking the people. Like, it's not just about kids. It's about people in church and teaching them the substance of this faith. I was going to teach a series in Bozeman, but I never got a chance to, called Christianity for Christians. Because we don't know our faith well enough. Most of the times that is true. And this is the whole thing. I talked about being spiritual advocates, and that's what we're going to do. About what we'll do, we're going to be spiritual advocates. But here's the point I want us to make. Since I went over that last week, this is the last thing is here. We need everyone. I knew I wouldn't get an amen to that. Amen. We need everyone in this church. Please understand me. I don't get a bonus for attendance. I don't get an award from magazines. Nobody's going to write an article about me. Understand, I don't even have an ego about it. I really don't. I know that there are people who have limitations. But worship, fellowship, discipleship does not happen in a single hour in church. And I'm not saying that your personal life isn't important. I'm saying that if we want to have, this is the thing, you have a gift, and you have a calling that the person next to you needs. That's how God arranges churches. That's how God does things, right? And so we need everyone because your gift and your calling and your skill is needed. We need a church full of people who are committed to advocating for Christ and his people before an increasingly hostile world. We just do. And how do we do it? It's simple. Worship. We come together here on Sunday morning to collectively remember that God is alive, that God is sovereign, and God is transcendent from this world. Can I get an amen for that? That's why we come here. That's why we sing the songs. It's why we open the Word. It's why we listen to a lunatic who always goes over time. Is to recognize that God is alive because how many hours do we spend in the world that is telling us differently? We come here to re-acknowledge that together. After being beat up and brutalized and subject to all sorts of propaganda in the world, we come here on Sunday morning and let's worship the Lord. Let's remember and be joyful and filled with praise that he is alive, he's living, he's transcendent, and whatever's going on out there, he's well aware of and he can handle just perfectly. But here's the other calling is discipleship. To collectively learn the substance of our faith together. That's what makes a strong church. To remember how it applies in an increasingly complex world. And learning this faith is the only hope. Learning the faith is the only hope for being able to competently explain and expectantly see life change in people around us. It is. That's what we're trying to do. And Sunday morning at 9, Wednesday night. That's what we're trying to join us. Like we said in that thing, man, one more yard. Just do one more. Come with us. It'll be worth it. Again, I know there's some limitations out here. I'm not trying to speak to that. But here's the other thing too, is fellowship. Last thing, fellowship, to collectively encourage each other that this world is not our home. We need that. Again, the most dire straits that a person can be in is to think that this world has the last word and it's all we have. Listen, we should come together and personally with each other fellowship to remind each other that we are not of this world, to care for one another in the way you cannot find in the world, and to remind each other that the sacrifices that we make for the gospel will be worth it all, to pray for one another and to see the brotherhood visibly. That's advocating for Christ. That's advocating for the gospel in this world. To know the prayer concerns of the brothers and sisters that you have next to you. To be involved to the extent that you can pray for them. You have the opportunities here. In smaller class settings and in homebodies and things of that nature. Join us. Listen, please. It's more than just listening for an hour. How many hours are in a week? I think I did that quick math last time. It was about 6 carry the 4, 176. Is that right? In a week? Does that sound right? Listen, 176 hours a week in the world. Is that right? 24 times 7? Oh, it's 8. Carry the 2. 168. 168 hours. I can do math in my head. I'm the last of my kind. I'm just asking this question again. Do you know your faith well enough?
To do that, you'll need to be online.
Okay. Do you know it well enough to make a difference in somebody else's life? Some are making really good efforts. Please understand that we can make a difference in the lives of the people around us and thereby make a difference in this culture. We have to prepare ourselves to do it. Join us. Father, this morning I'm glad for the people who are here. And Father, for, Lord, your word that promises to transform lives in ways that the world can't. Lord, I'm grateful for these people. Lord, their fellowship, their friendship has been an incredible blessing. And Lord, I pray that what has come across is an urgency in my spirit to produce believers that can make a difference in the world. And Lord, help us to do that. Lord, help us to encourage one another, to love and to good works. Lord, help us to prod each other. Lord, to go beyond. To understand that we must be in the world, but we aren't of the world. And that a deepening understanding of that is what leads to genuine change of life, not just ours, but the ones around us. God, help us this morning as we come before your throne to bring this matter before you. In Christ's name.